In this week's video, I'm going to tell you about 16 flower and botanical drawing mistakes that you might be making. And the good news is they're really easy to fix. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolor, as well as lots of drawing tutorials, mixed media, even a little bit of motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's completely free. I've got 16 drawing mistakes that you might be making with botanicals and flowers this week. Some of them are going to be actual physical drawing mistakes. Some of them will be more about materials, and some of them will be in reference to what you might be doing with that drawing later on. Perhaps it's an underdrawing for a painting, or perhaps it's just a drawing for drawing's sake. We're going to cover all of that. We're going through 16 mistakes, and I'm going to tell you exactly how to fix them. Mistake number one is one of the biggest mistakes that people make for all different subjects, but it can be especially prevalent when you're doing something that seems a little bit sort of sketchy and ethereal, much more than if you're doing something solid like a building, and that's to not plan your composition. So whenever I can in this video, I'm going to draw with a biro, as we like to call them in the UK, a ballpoint pen, just because you can see more easily on camera. There will be occasions when I use a proper pencil as well because it's necessary, but if I'm just showing you basic layout and things like that, I'm going to use a dark pen so that you can see it. Now let's take a look at this picture here. So I've got two flowers in here, and I want to think about the composition, because maybe my paper, this is landscape shaped, this photograph, but maybe my paper is not, maybe my paper is square, and I want to fit those things on nicely, because what can happen is if you just start drawing that larger flower, you've got no real idea of knowing how big or small anything's going to be. You can end up going off the edge of the paper. So you can do what they call a thumbnail sketch. You can make these as big or small as possible. You can just draw a box. So say I'm going to do a square picture. I'll draw a square box. And you're doing this separate to your main piece of paper. And then I'll just start sort of thinking about where those flower shapes might fit in and how they're going to sit nicely on the paper. It can be as simple as that. You know, don't overcomplicate it. You just want to make sure that you're getting things in the right place. And then when you go onto your main piece of paper, you want to actually start making marks. So imagine this is the actual paper you're working on and you're working in pencil. You want to say to yourself, right, well, that larger flower, I don't want it to come any higher than this, and it mustn't come any further across than this. It goes a little bit beyond halfway, so I'll place a mark here, and then the top of the other flower is going to be about here, the bottom is going to be about here, and I'll have something like this going on. And you want to be planning that layout in tiny little pencil marks right from the start so that you know everything is going to fit on. There is absolutely no point going into a really elaborate drawing if you don't even know how things are going to sit on your paper. Mistake number two is not making enough of your flowers. Now, you may do a beautiful vase in a still life, and the vase may be the main event. You may perhaps draw a beautiful leaf, and the leaf may be the main event. But if you're drawing flowers, the flowers are always the main event. Let me show you how people tend to get this wrong. No matter how interesting your vase, no matter how beautiful your leaves, if you're doing flowers, the flowers need to be the main event. And what I often used to see when I was, going around my art classes is people would spend so long drawing the vase and getting everything there looking nice, and they'd get their vase in, and then they'd get their stems in, and then they'd start putting their flowers in. And this is not just a matter of going off the edge of the paper, which of course can happen. It's just that the main event is just way too small. So you've got a couple of options here. One thing you can do is to move that vase right the way down so that you're just doing the top of the vase, and then 3/4 of the paper is filled with the flowers. That can look all right. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Another thing to do is just to, quite reduce the size of your vase in comparison to your flowers. And this may be, if you're photographing yourself, if you're taking the photo yourself, you could actually take a higher angle and sort of get an upper perspective on the vase. So you're looking down at it a little bit more. And what this will do, this will, fill your paper with flowers, and you're just going to get something much better going on. and your picture is going to be just much more interesting than it was before. So remember that the flowers are the star of the show. Give them enough room, particularly if you're going to paint them afterwards. You know, if you've got some beautiful pink flowers, you don't want to find when you come to the painting that everything's about the vase. That's soul destroying. Now, vases can be, you know, very beautiful, and you may have some nice patterns on your vase. You know, you may have some nice stuff going on, maybe a really interesting addition to your picture, but nevertheless, you want to consider that the main event is usually the flowers. Mistake number 3 is not fully drawing solid objects first. So in any botanical or flower painting, you may have some solid objects. That may be a vase, that may be a garden pot, it may even be a brick wall. Let me explain why it's so important to draw these first and to draw them fully. Now, whatever your subject, the solid objects are the things that anchor your picture. Whether that's a nice sturdy tree trunk, some steps, some pots, perhaps you're working indoors, but you want to be thinking about those objects first because they are going to allow you to place everything in. One thing that I used to see people do is they would draw sort of part of a pot, like they draw the front like that, and then they've got, you know, their plants or whatever growing up the top, and then they're kind of trying to almost, you know, make up where the back goes. What you want to do, and obviously I've got a pen here, but you'll have a pencil. What you want to do is to fully draw those things, and then whatever comes over the top, comes over the top. And that way you can just rub out the bits that you don't need, and you've got a nice rounded looking or square looking object. Because if you start getting to the point where you're sort of drawing things almost like a 1950s cartoon, you know, completely cut out, there isn't really any back to it, then things are going to start looking very strange. So you want to get everything drawn in, draw your plants over the top, and then just erase the bits that you don't need. Mistake number 4 is using the wrong pencil. There are several types of pencil that you can use. Let's look at the different grades and when it's appropriate to choose them. So I've changed to a little piece of watercolor paper here because it shows texture more effectively. So I've got an HB pencil here. Now, I don't usually like to draw with an HB because they can be rather hard to erase. So you don't want to press hard, but actually for botanicals, an HB is a really good option. You can also use something a little softer. This is a 4B. This will erase more easily, but you see that it leaves much more of a scruffy mark. Flower petals are really delicate and smooth. You need to really keep them looking pristine. And so I do like an HB for botanical work. This is an 8B, pretty much the softest pencil you can get. You see how dark it is and how sketchy. It's also very smudgy. You can end up with very scruffy looking work. However, a pencil like this is great for shading. And if we move back to our smoother paper, what I would like to do is to draw my outline with this HB pencil. And then I can start doing any shading I need to do with a softer pencil. And I'll almost certainly want to use some kind of blending tool. Here I've just got a cosmetic tissue to work on those details, going in with a harder pencil where I need a more definite line, changing to softer pencils where I need things to be blacker, and using a blending tool whenever necessary. Now, if you are drawing on watercolor paper because you're going to paint afterwards, I would suggest just using an HB pencil, but do remember not to press hard, because if you press hard, you will dent the paper, and then even if you erase the line, you'll find the paint sits in that mistake and you can still see it later on. So when you're using a pencil like this, very, very lightly indeed, and a soft putty eraser to remove. At this point in the video, if you're enjoying this video and getting some value from it, could I please ask you to give me that thumbs up, that like button? If you like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people. I can help more people learn to paint and draw. Your support on this channel helps me to make more free videos like this one. Mistake number 5 is not studying your flowers carefully enough before you start. Let's talk about the importance of understanding your subject and really looking carefully at your flower and at the structure of it. I've got this poppy here, for example. Now, I could just start painting this, it's a photograph, but there's areas of it where I don't really understand. Is this one petal behind? How many petals do these even have? Luckily, nowadays with Google and reverse image search, we can pretty much get an idea of anything. If you're working from a real vase of flowers, don't be afraid to pick them up, really have a look at them. Unless you've got some kind of genetic abnormality, I mean the flower, not you, obviously, unless you've got some kind of genetic thing going on or some kind of unusual insect eating or something like that, every single flower in the species is going to have the same amount of petals. So if you have a vase full of all the same flowers and you pick one up and you see, well, this has 5 petals, so you can guarantee that all of those other flowers in your vase also have 5 petals. It's really important to understand how many petals something has, how it's attached at the base, what it looks like from behind, because otherwise, especially if you're just going from a photograph like this one, you can get yourself in a muddle. So do a little bit of research, study the flower, pick it up, look at it, turn it over, see how it's structured. And if you don't have the ability to do that because you're working from a photograph, then Google is your friend. The more you understand about the subject, the more easily you will be able to draw it. Mistake number 6 is facing all of your flowers forwards because you don't quite understand how to get flowers turned over to one side or facing up or facing down. I've got a really simple trick that's going to help you. Do you find when drawing flowers, they all end up facing forwards like this one here? You can't seem to get those subtle turns and twists. I've got a simple method for you. You're going to look for 2 things. You're going to find the center point of the flower and you're going to draw the outside shape. Now, if you've got a flower that's covered in lots of little florets or it's got tons and tons of petals, like this one here, you'll find that there's still a central area. You can see where the petals become more dense. You can see where everything's coming from. If you've got one of those flowers that's like a lupin that's got lots of little flowers on one, I'll show you how to deal with those later in the video. But all you have to do is find the center point. Now, the center point of this flower here isn't here. It's where the petals are coming from here. But let's look at an easier one. Let's look at this one here. So I'm going to find the center and then I'm going to draw the outside shape. Do you see how it's much flatter here? Look how much closer the center is to here than to here. So we can use that as our starting point. So we're going to find the center of the flower. We're going to draw the shape of the flower. This is just a rough shape, not worrying at this point about individual petals. Let's go onto the pen now so that you can see more clearly. So I've got my outside shape here. What I can do now is just fill in like so, looking at my flower all the time for reference, seeing how these things are shaped. And straight away, I've got a flower that's facing in a different direction. This works for all sorts of flowers. All you have to remember is find the center point and find the outside shape, being careful to notice how close that center point is. It may be high or low, it may be left or right. All of that is going to give you an idea of how to draw your flower. Mistake number 7 is not always working from a center point. Now, everything that grows tends to come from a stem or from a center point. Even within a bush of flowers, there'll be multiple flowers that all come from that center point. Things grow up from stems. It's really important to think of that central idea and of everything coming from one point and everything growing up, because what can happen otherwise is we can start to lose track with our drawing. So what do I mean? So look at this white flower here. See how everything is coming from this center point. So that's quite easy when we first start drawing and we think, well, everything comes up from the middle. We've got these things in the middle here and we've got the petals coming out like so. And they're all coming from this center point. And, so far, so good. But what can start to happen is we can start to sort of lose track of where things actually are coming from. So as we start to go out to these other petals, what can happen is we can start to just sort of tack them on like that. Now, what happens then is if I am to follow this curve to its natural conclusion, You can see it's not coming from the centre at all. So it can be quite a nice idea with these outer petals, again, to be thinking about that centre line that might be coming through something, and then to be using that as a guideline. Obviously you would erase this line. What you don't want to do is just tack things on the outside without always considering that they're growing from a centre point. Mistake number 8 is not always using a centre line for petals and leaves. Now, as humans, we're really bad about going around the outside of the edge of something and sort of keeping it the right shape. It's just not something our brains do very well. Our hand-to-eye coordination just isn't up to the job. What you can do, especially with something like a leaf, is you can find the center line first, and then you can use that to draw the rest of the leaf around. You can do this with petals too. Now, there may not always be an obvious center line, but you can usually see where it is. These petals here have multiple lines, and so we can get an idea of where a center line might go and how it might look. We can see that it would curve around here and come up here and curve out slightly. So I can take that idea of a center line. We're using this as a guideline. It's going to then allow me to draw that petal more effectively and get the shape right. Mistake number 9 is all about not using the envelope technique for complex shapes. I do have a longer video all about the envelope technique. I'll leave that in the description of this video. But meantime, let me show you how you can easily use this technique to make more complex shapes. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we're not very good as humans at sort of tracing the outside shape of something, just starting to draw and then starting to draw some more and adding some more petals and some more and going up and up. You've really no idea how big it's going to be, and you'll also lose track of the shape of it. The same goes with complex shaped leaves. What you want to do is start by drawing an outside envelope. So what this can look like is just getting an idea, almost like a straight angle shape. Could be a box, or it could have multiple sides, and you're just going to be drawing a shape like so. Also considering that it's got a center stem, so we'd have maybe a guideline coming up like this. What we've got now is we've got an area that we can fit things into, and I know now how big it's going to end up. I'm not going to lose control of the shape of it, make it too big or too small. I'm not going to find that I keep drawing these petals and they're all the wrong size and they're just getting bigger and bigger and going higher and higher up, and I'm off the end of my paper. We're making ourselves a guideline within which to put our shapes. This can also work well with leaves that are very complex shapes. If you've got something, for instance, with a serrated edge, it doesn't even have to be a square-sided shape. You can make it curved if you need to. So we do our outside shape, and then when we actually come to draw, we can do our serrations. If we try to draw the shape of the leaf and the serrations at the same time, we will find that we go completely wrong with it. So if you have a complex shape with a very raggedy edge or lots of smaller shapes inside, I want you to use the envelope technique to get an outline first that's going to keep everything under control. Mistake number 10 is drawing round things, not through them. Let me explain what I mean. So what do I mean by drawing round things, not through them? Now imagine I've got this pansy here, and there's a big leaf that goes behind it. Say it's something like a tulip leaf. It's going to go right behind and out the other side. Now what people will tend to do is they'll tend to sketch the leaf like this, and they'll start the leaf, and then somewhere up here they'll carry on the leaf. And what can happen is it can become completely out of alignment. In other words, where it enters here doesn't quite match where it comes out here, and should it even be showing here, we're not sure. So what you want to do, and obviously you'll erase part of it, and you can do this by kind of almost skimming your pencil lightly. Let's erase some of these previous lines. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to come through like this and out, and the other side I'm going to come through and out. Now I'll just erase the parts I don't need, and now I have this big leaf that comes behind, and I know that it's going to fit completely naturally behind the object in front, and everything is going to line up nicely. Mistake number 11 is not considering texture. This goes for drawing but also painting. Let's look at the different parts of a plant or a flower and consider why texture is so important. So let's go back to that drawing that I started and talk about texture. Now you see that I was using a blending tool because the thing with botanicals is that many of them are very smooth and very delicate. So you want to keep your mark making smooth and delicate too. If you're doing anything like being really scribbly, cross hatching like this, you're immediately going to make a rough looking surface. So the way that you apply the medium to the paper, whether that is charcoal or pastel or watercolor paint, where you can consider smooth paint versus granular paint, the texture that you get on the paper is going to be indicative of the type of surface you're making. So something smooth like a flower petal, it's almost like a piece of silk. You need to have a very smooth application and very smooth shading. And if you've got something that's a little rougher, I'll drop in some B-roll footage here of an amaryllis bulb that I've been given. I've been trying to get this thing to flower for absolutely months now, but you can see the difference between all of this rough brown foliage and then you can see the beautiful smooth leaves that it has. So you want to be thinking about how you apply your pencil or your paint because it's going to mimic the surface. And you also need to consider the type of paper you're using. Think about this watercolor paper and how much of a rougher edge you're getting. Now, of course, if you're going to be working on watercolors on this paper, it's going to be great. But if you're drawing and you're drawing flowers, do you see how textured it is? Conversely, you don't want a surface that's too smooth and shiny, because if you have paper that's smooth and shiny, it generally means that it's very synthetic, it's been pressed very flat, and you'll find that you can't get any darks on that paper. So both the way that you apply the pencil and the surface that you apply it to are going to help you when it comes to showing smoothness versus roughness. Now, to be clear, there are some botanicals, including fruit skins, things like that, certain leaves that are very rough, very textured, perhaps even furry. So do consider the application of the medium and the paper surface so that you're getting the most realistic results. Mistake number 12 is something I used to see all the time when I was teaching art classes, and that's drawings that are too scruffy and too small. This particularly applies if you're going to put paint on top, but also applies if you're just doing a drawing. So here I've got a daisy type flower, and let me show you how some of my students used to draw a flower like this. Now I've changed to watercolor paper here because it's especially bad if you're going to paint on top of your drawing, but even if you're just drawing, this isn't good. And what I would see people doing is they would be using a very blunt pencil like this and really making quite small marks like this. And I used to look at it and think to myself, where on earth is the paint going to fit? Because there just isn't much room here. And by the time I'd come round, everything was likely very smudged as well. If you work too small, and sometimes I would see people with a huge piece of paper, literally drawing like this. This is something they were going to paint afterwards. And it's just impossible. You're setting yourself up for failure. So you want to be drawing nice, big petals that you have some hope of either getting a paintbrush into afterwards or getting some shading into if you're working in pencil alone. Make sure that things are big enough and make sure that there's room inside each petal to work. Mistake number 13 is a stilted or dotted drawing style. Let me show you how to fix this one. Now, a method that beginners often use when they're drawing something, I'll do a leaf here, is they'll dot like this. And they'll try and very carefully, get the shape right. So why do people do this? It's because it gives you more control and you're less likely to go wrong. But the problem is you end up with something that's really, really stilted. When you're drawing flowers or leaves, I want you to be really free and just to let the pen or the pencil or the paintbrush flow. Will you get a less accurate result? Yes, you may do, but there's so much variation within botanicals that you'll get away with it. And it's far better to have something that actually looks like it's got some life in it than something that's been really, really carefully drawn to try and get the shape exactly right and just ends up looking like a dead thing rather than something that's flowing and growing. Mistake number 14 is all about doing underdrawings for working in another medium, whether that's paint or pastels or something else. Let me explain what you should be using and what I don't recommend for underdrawing. So graphite pencil is not always the best thing to start a painting with. It depends what sort of painting you're doing or what sort of artwork you are creating. So one mistake that I often see is people using graphite pencil as an underdrawing to something like pastels. It seems a safer option because we know that we can erase graphite, but the truth is that once you've got a load of pastel on top, it's not going to erase and it's going to be so noticeable by the end of your picture. So the rule in general is to use the same medium to do your underdrawing as your main picture is going to be in. So for something like this, you would choose a soft pastel that's similar in colour to your picture. Believe me, even if you make mistakes, it'll smudge in afterwards. The same goes for charcoal and oil pastels. Don't do your underdrawing in graphite pencil. Now you can use graphite pencil as we've spoken about for watercolors and for inks. Do keep it light though. Another mistake that I see people making, and this is often recommended to beginners, and that's to use a watercolor pencil as your underdrawing. And I saw someone the other day say quite confidently, just use a watercolor pencil. It'll disappear when you put the water on. Now, I would like to know the kind of physics that they are relying on, whereby water completely vaporizes watercolor pencil and all pigment is gone from your paper. Because as far as I'm concerned, all watercolor pencil is doing for your painting is giving you scruffy edges and diluting your colours. Now, I'd love to use watercolour pencils alone. You can use your watercolour pencils as your underdrawing in that case. I also love to use them with watercolour. I love adding them on top of watercolour. They can be really beautiful. And I'm not saying that using them for an underdrawing can never work under any circumstances. I'm just saying, think about your life choices. Nothing disappears completely because you add water to it. Do consider how that underdrawing in watercolour pencil is going to be affecting the colours that go on next. For mistake number 15, it's doing all of the drawing at the beginning. Yes, you need to plan at the beginning, but some subjects can be so complex that drawing right at the start, drawing absolutely everything you see, can become overwhelming and confusing. Let me give you a better way. Here's a close-up of one of my gouache paintings. Now, did I plan this in advance? Did I plan where to place everything? Yes, I did. But did I do all of the drawing at the beginning? No, I didn't. Can you imagine? I'd get completely lost in it. Look at all this lot. Look at everything that's going on. So you want to plan your basic layout, but don't be afraid to draw as you go through the picture. I showed you previously how we can add things in behind other things, and we can gradually build up. What this will do as well is that it'll put the pencil marks on the top of things, which means they're easier to erase. So if you are painting, your pencil won't be trapped underneath layers and layers of paint. Mistake number 16 is quite a basic beginner's mistake, and that's doing shading when you're going to put paint on top. So one mistake that beginners often make when they're starting to learn watercolour painting is they'll start shading their underdrawing like this. Now, it's a simple rule, this one. Graphite pencil is going to block your watercolour. It's going to make it apply badly. It's going to show through and it's going to make everything look muddy. So consider when you start a drawing, are you drawing just to make a full graphite pencil drawing? In which case, go right ahead with your shading. But are you doing a drawing just to show you where to place things later on? In which case, you only want the barest outline, because all of your shading will happen with your paint, with your paintbrush, and this is going to make your paintings much brighter and cleaner. And that's really important with flowers, because as soon as flowers start to look mucky and murky, they begin to look dead. So do let me know in the comments which one of these mistakes you've been making. Perhaps you've been making lots of mistakes. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of a clearer idea of how to move forward. Every day that you practice your drawing, you're doing a little bit better. Now, before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. Any videos that I've mentioned that will help you along this learning journey are listed in that video description. There's also some free stuff down there. You can download a free PDF or even take a free course with me. And if you've enjoyed this video, you can watch another one of my drawing videos right now.